Following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared in the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
So it is Saturday, and we are going to be talking about money. We're on KLFE, the answer, so it must be the answer about money. So anyway, welcome to the program. Glad to have you here. The purpose of this program is to put you, the listener, ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve, to put you into a focus of what's coming and not what has been. And today I think that's very, very special as we look forward to something. I think we're going to be going through a world change. It's going to impact investments. It's going to impact the political order, the world order. So I think it's something that you need to think about and think of because it will impact investments. It's going to impact almost all the aspects of our life. And that is the shriveling demand for oil in the years to come. I want to take you back. If you've listened to the program very long, you know that I've shared this story a few times, but I want to take you back to the start of the 20th century, 1900. The mode of transportation, the mode of getting things around at that time was the horse. And there was one horse for every 10 to 20 residents in each city. So think about a city of 1 million people. That would be 100,000 horses, somewhere around 100,000 horses. And in the largest cities, like New York City, there were hundreds of thousands of horses, and each horse left 30 to 50 pounds of manure in 2 quarts of urine every day, and most of that went on the streets. Piles of manure 40 and 50 and 60 feet high all over the city where it was swept up and moved out of the way. There were thousands of dead horses and goats and pigs and cattle embedded in the uncollected filth, and it was left there for days and weeks. There were dogs and cats and rats that had died. Sometimes the manure and the mess there was 2 to 3 feet high. There were people that were hired. If you wanted to cross from one side of the street to the other, there were people that made a living shoveling the way from one side of the street to the other side of the street. You know, it's a picture you don't get when you look at movies. You don't get that from TV. That's something that existed, was there, and was a significant problem. Diphtheria, whooping cough, typhoid, typhus, fevers and diseases. Hard to fathom today. Hard to think about that today. And with all that, it wasn't clean because of social consciousness. It wasn't clean. There were international symposiums on how do we deal with this issue. How do we deal with it? International symposiums, and the U.S. would send some of their best scientists to those symposiums. How do we take care of this? And then along came the automobile, and the horse dependence went away. Changed the industry, changed the farming, the agriculture, changed the outlook on where we lived, how we lived. It was a world change. Along with all that manure and urine and all the complications, that went away. It was a world change. It changed the world order. It was something that made a significant difference. And I'm thinking that the same thing is about to happen with oil. In the 1970s, there was the oil crisis. There's a book out called The Oil Kings, How the U.S., Iran, Saudi Arabia changed the balance of power in the Middle East, written by Scott Cooper. And he talks about, well, he got the information through the Freedom of Information Act, and he got the information about the backdoor negotiations between President Nixon, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and the Shah of Iran. So Kissinger and Nixon viewed Iran, this is before the Shah was overthrown and before the new regime came into effect. Iran was governed by the Shah. And Nixon and Kissinger viewed Iran as holding back the Soviet Union from their policies in the Middle East. The Soviet Union very much wanted to influence and impact the Middle East. The United States viewed Iran as the key player in the Middle East to hold back Soviet aggression, to hold back Soviet influence. And they felt that they were the key military area to hold the military in the Middle East. The Shah, on the other hand, wanted to rebuild the Persian Empire. He wanted to get back to the glory and the splendor of what was once the Persian Empire. And in order to do that, he wanted to have a control of the military order in the Middle East. He wanted the U.S. to build military bases, and we did. And we sent thousands of troops and workers to build the military bases and to man the military bases. And we sent some of the most advanced military equipment to the Shah of Iran. And to pay for it, he negotiated oil deals with Nixon and Kissinger. Wasn't public information, wasn't in the public. It all happened through backdoor negotiations. And as this was taking place, the Shah's appetite continued to increase for more and more military equipment and bases and support from the U.S. More and more was needed. And in order to pay for that, he needed more and more oil revenues. And so it was all on that basis that he wanted to raise prices as well as supply. If you're only able to supply X amount, if you need more revenues, you've got to raise prices, and that's what he wanted to do. And he helped put together OPEC to provide even greater leverage on the price of oil. And you know what happened in the 1970s. We were already on our way with inflation really ticking up. It had reached almost the mid-single digits. It had actually reached over 6% by the end of 68 or 69. And so inflation was already taking place, but when you added the oil price increases to that and a shortage of oil, it pumped a lot of other prices up. It's a classic microeconomic response, by the way. The Middle East became the world and industry changers. And it's about to change again, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The response to that was the classic microeconomic response. As microeconomics says, as prices go up, demand goes down. And that's what began to happen. The highest per capita consumption of oil in the U.S. was the early 1970s. We've never consumed as much oil per capita as we did then. But we have more people, and so we're getting more oil consumed in the U.S. But the high prices also meant something else. If the price was high, it meant it was possible to drill oil in a lot of other places. And so there became more drilling as prices rose, so did supply. And not just more drilling, but on the other side, the more conservation efforts. So oil prices worked their way up to $120 a barrel in the late 1970s. By the 90s, it was down to $20. It had lost 5/6 of the price. So if you remember, about a decade ago, we also had a run-up in oil prices. The concern a decade ago was that we were going to run out of oil. We were going to reach what was called peak oil. That was because oil was continuing to grow in demand, or demand for oil was continuing to grow. I've talked time and again about the supercycle and the emergence of those, what used to be called third party or third world countries, now called the emerging nations, as they emerge, as they began to develop, they demanded more and more oil. China became a big consumer of oil. So did India. So did the former Soviet countries. So did the rest of the world as they continued to grow. So the demand for oil was increasing, and there was a concern that we were going to run out of oil. It was called the peak oil. That was about a decade ago. But peak oil is now coming back into play. People are beginning, a few people, and I am one of them, that's beginning to talk about peak oil. This time, it's not that we're going to run out of oil. It's peak oil, the maximum demand we're going to see. And it's not going to be because we've run out of oil or that oil's become scarce, but it's because we're maximizing the oil. Back a decade ago, it was a concern that there was going to be so much scarcity that the world was going to be plunged into the dark age. There were going to be wars and famines and Great Depressions. It sounded so dire. It sounded just like the piles of manure that I started the program with. Things looked terrible. Things looked bad. But what's happening today? What is peak oil today? Don't go away. I want to come back to this after the commercial break. We are commercial breaking right now. Don't go away. Be right back.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I have been talking about oil, a global world change taking place. It's going to impact investments. It's going to impact the world order. There's going to be a very significant change happening, and you should be really aware of it. You know, there's still a growing need for energy, but there's also an issue with global warming. I've talked any number of times about the super cycle, the cycle where the world GDP grows at a faster rate for a significant period of time, faster rate than average. The first from 1870 to 1913, driven by the industrialization of the United States. The second supercycle from 1945 to 1970, driven by the rebuilding of Europe, the decolonization. You know, the U.S. was going through the rebuilding of the infrastructure, the interstate highway system, airports. All that was going on. Housing was going on. That's where the U.S. was. From 2009, the supercycle has begun, and it's being driven by the emerging nations. And as they grow, they need additional energy supplies. But at the same time, we're living in a time in which there's global warming, climate change, and that could impact world growth, but probably won't. What's going to happen is we're going to come to peak oil. If we see already what's happening with renewable energy, it's not just the utilities that are changing, but major companies like AT&T, Norsk Hydro, Alcoa, Microsoft, Walmart, Amazon, Kohl's, Macy's, Apple, Intel, IKEA, Google, Facebook. Those companies are building solar farms to supply their computer needs, their stores. They're beginning to build solar-derived energy. They're pumping their own energy into their system. And so what we're seeing is a move to renewables. Currently, if you look at where we are, the total energy supplied by renewables in the world is 11%. 17% of electricity is supplied by renewables. The International Energy Agency is forecasting that by 2040, 40% of all the world's energy will be supplied by renewables. Remember, energy consumption is growing. It's not just 40% of what we're producing today. It's a growth as well. And my guess is that's low. Consider this. 1/3 of all oil goes to powering gas-consuming cars and trucks. 1/3 of all the oil. And if you look around at what's happening in regards to the internal combustion engine, there's been a significant change. I did a program 3 years ago when Mary Barra of GM and the oil minister from Saudi Arabia both predicted that they weren't concerned about electric vehicles because by 2040, they expected to sell 1 billion cars and less than 1% would be electric. I said at that time, I would be surprised if it wasn't 25%. Today, I'd be surprised if it wasn't 75 or 80%. What we're seeing is the car companies are beginning to convert to electric cars. And I drive one. I know. I mean, it's an incredible machine. Sometimes I think it's a software program masquerading as a car, but that's another story. We're already seeing a switch to electric vehicles. And whether that company, Tesla, makes it or not, the vehicle is changing the focus of automobile making. So back to peak oil. There was an article out of The Economist, and this most recent article in The Economist, and they talk about peak oil. It's back in the news again, only different this time. Instead of running out of oil, this time it's the opposite. It's dwindling demand. Less oil needed for gasoline and gasoline products, less going into the production of electricity. It's going to be, while the oil industry predicts oil growth is going to continue, consumption is going to continue at 1.4% growth for the next 10 years, the same as it's been growing since 2008, and then it will plateau out. I think those forecasts are going to be wrong. They've been wrong, significantly wrong in the past. I believe they're going to be wrong. We're seeing a shift take place to renewables. And in order to meet the climate goals, output of oil has to drop 25 to 50%. Think of where that's coming from. Even from vehicles, a significant portion is going to happen there. While the forecast is 40% renewables by 2040, I wouldn't be surprised if we're not looking at 40% by 2030. And that's going to make a huge change in the petroleum industry. Right now, if you look at the petroleum industry, there's $16 trillion of capital that's been invested in the petroleum industry. There are 10 million jobs that are related to the petroleum industry. And when you begin to downsize, it's not going to be easy. Consider the U.S. 40% of our energy needs come from oil. Fracking has meant that the U.S. has become, if not an exporter yet, we soon will be. But fracking is dirty, and it requires $40 to $50 per barrel of oil. If demand really begins to drop, what happens to oil prices? We saw that. In 2014, we saw demand drop off, and we saw oil prices drop down as low as $20 a barrel. If fracking to break even is $40 to $50, what does that do to fracking? What does that do to small companies? You know, what we saw in 2014 and 16 when prices plunged as low as, well, $20 was abnormal, but $30 a barrel, we saw hundreds of small companies go bankrupt, oil companies related in the oil industry. What happens worldwide when that happens? And when you begin to think about where we are in political events, Saudi Arabia, if you take the cost to lift oil out of the ground, Saudi Arabia is able to lift oil out of the ground at $3 to $8 a barrel. They're the lowest in the world. Iran, Iraq, about the same. In the U.S., we're paying $21 an average to lift the oil. Shale at about $24. In Brazil, it's $35. In the UK, it's $44. So it's not just companies in the industry that are going to go through an upheaval. There's going to be political upheaval too. When you consider 26 countries rely on oil income. for more than 5% of their GDP. On the average in those 26 countries, 18% of their GDP comes from oil. What happens when oil prices plunge? And they will probably plunge. I mean, the dirtiest and dearest prices come from Algeria and Brazil and Canada and Nigeria and Venezuela. What happens to those countries? They depend in large part on the oil that they sell into the world, a good part of their GDP. So the change is coming. It's changing to the energy industry. It's going to impact countries. It's going to impact companies. It's not going to be immediate, but I think it's going to happen faster than most people visualize. And it's something to be aware of, something to put in the back of your head, to keep in mind, to think about the changes that are going to take place in industry and in companies and investments and the world order. I started the program talking about the change that happened as we converted from horsepower to car power. This could be a very significant change, as great as that was, or even greater. So, keep it in mind. The purpose of this program is to put you ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve. I'm looking way out into the future, and maybe not that far into the future. But keep it in mind, because the world is changing. Investments change. And when investments change, that's opportunity. And talking about manure, I want to introduce my guest today, Will Nichols of Green Latrine. Welcome to the program, Will.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So, why don't we start with your background?
That was a great intro, by the way. I can't let that one go unnoticed. That was pretty good. Very smooth.
Thanks. So let's start with your background. Tell us about it.
So I'm a Seattle guy, born and raised. Mom worked at UW for over 30 years. Then I went to school back in Virginia, the same place Thomas Jefferson went to school at William & Mary, and then started working in D.C., did a few years in politics before coming back to Seattle. Got a little homesick, came home, and then got my master's at UW. And then went to work in some nonprofits, did a handful, 7 years, working for 2 different great nonprofits. And then in 2015, decided I needed to start a portable toilet company. And here we are now, about 5 years later, and Green Latrine has been the last 5 years of my life.
So we're going to talk about Green Latrine. We're coming up to a commercial break, and we're going to talk about Green Latrine and what's going on in that industry. It's one that you don't hear a lot about, probably for some reasons that most people don't want to talk about it, but it is part of the fabric of the country. It's part of what goes on everywhere you go. If you go to events, if you go to sporting events, if you go to fairs, you'll see latrines out there. It's important to know what's going on to get a full picture of what's happening. So we'll come back to Will after the commercial break. If you've missed any of these programs, you can find them on YouTube. You can find them on our website. You should like us on Facebook. You should follow us on Twitter. Right now that Sarah, during the program, is tweeting as we talk, so you get an up-to-date that way as well. Don't go away, because we are coming up to a commercial break. Check us out at adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Check out our performance. We've had a really good performance this year. We expect that next year is going to be a tougher year. I'm going to be talking about it as the weeks come by. 2020 could be a very rough year. I have a plan for it, though, for my clients. We'll be talking more about it. Don't go away.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I'm here with Will Nichols of Green Latrine. Let's talk about Green Latrine. Talk about how you started, talk about how you got into the business, and talk about the business itself.
Well, that covers a lot of ground. Like for anybody who starts a business, it's not just one event or one action. It's sort of a a culmination of a few years process. The idea of being entrepreneurial first has to sort of, be in there. I'm lucky I have a brother who's extremely entrepreneurial, and so he and I went up to Calgary, Canada, and learned from a friend of his who he had done some internet consulting with, some projects in the past. And so we go up to Calgary and spend a week. I was on the truck, my brother was in the office, and we learned the portable toilet business as best we could in a week. And he and I looked at each other and said, that was a lot of fun. Let's go home and do that. So we came back from Calgary in 2015 and decided it was what we were going to do. And so we started the process of getting all the toilets and getting the trucks, and man, it was a lot. It was a lot.
And so you had to assemble the toilet, right?
Sadly, yes, and that was a good first learning. They showed up in a 53-foot shipping container on the back of a semi-truck. They came in from Michigan. Our manufacturer was in Michigan. So the truck driver shows up, and when you order from Amazon or you order from UPS, you get somebody who delivers that box to you. When you take possession of a 53-foot shipping container, there's a truck driver, and that's it. And he expects you to unload his trailer in a couple hours because he's on the clock. He doesn't get paid unless he's driving. And so I didn't know that. And this 53-foot shipping container shows up with 120 unassembled portable toilets, and I had to go find a rental company and a forklift, and luckily the rental company had a guy, and he was nice enough to come help me, and I paid him for the day, and it took us a couple hours. Truck driver was not pleased that it took as long as it did, but we got them unloaded into the warehouse, temporary warehouse I had rented, and then we started the process of assembling these things. And the first unit took us about a day and a half. I say a day, but yesterday I had lunch with my friend who helped us get started, and he corrected me. It took a day and a half on the first box. And then we got that down to now, after 5 years of doing it, I can put one together in about 45 minutes. But for that first unit, day one, it took about a day and a half to assemble it, and then now it takes about 45 minutes. But yeah, some painful lessons. I learned that a hand rivet gun is just not going to work. You have to have the air compressor, you got to have the hose, you got to have the power rivet gun, or else you're going to, it's not going to happen. So yeah, learned a lot, had a great, real education as we got going there.
So green latrine, tell us why green latrine.
Yeah, that's the question. So industry standard, and it's getting better, but when I started, industry standard was in the blue goo, for lack of a better term, in the toilet deodorizer is formaldehyde. And that is industry standard across the country. It's perfectly legal. And here in Seattle, Puget Sound, King County, that blue goo gets dumped at the South Seattle treatment plant in Renton, just off of Grady Way, the King County wastewater facility. So we dump that waste into there, and then it gets through the sewer plant, and all of that liquid gets pumped straight back into Puget Sound. So when you see an NPR story, or you hear something in the media about the toxicity of our local Puget Sound salmon, when there's formaldehyde in those fish, most likely the culprit is portable toilets. And so we decided we didn't want to do that, and so I started researching other ways of deodorizing a portable toilet. And
so before we go, formaldehyde, why do they use formaldehyde?
Well, sadly, formaldehyde is a highly effective chemical. Obviously, most people associate it with the embalming of a human corpse. So a funeral home would use formaldehyde to embalm a human corpse. So if the formaldehyde can cut the odor, cut the smell on human, rotting human flesh, it's a really good chemical.
So it's all about keeping the smell down.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you have a toilet at home, you flush it, it's gone. There's no reason for your toilet bowl water to have any form of chemical or anything in there to take away the smell, because it's not going to sit there long enough. But on a construction site, we typically come around once a week. For a fair, festival, something like that, we're coming around a lot more often. But it's going to sit there for hours, days, a week, and obviously smell is going to build pretty high when you're dealing with that type of waste. So yeah, the formaldehyde cuts the odor, cuts the smell, and it's a very effective chemical in doing so.
But you're not using formaldehyde, so tell us what you use.
Yeah,
why.
so we after a little bit of research, found there are ways to do it without formaldehyde. So we use what's an enzyme biocide, and it is very similar in look. You would never look at our toilet and say, oh, that's a different thing. But the chemical compound inside the blue goo is an enzyme and a biocide, and it does not contain any formaldehyde. So, when we started early on, we were sort of early to market in that, and now 5 years later, very luckily, many other companies have caught up to us, and now far more people are aware of this issue and using the non-formaldehyde formula.
So I would imagine that you also dump your blue goo at the sewage plant.
Yes.
And what happens when you dump your blue goo? What happens to it? It goes into the Puget Sound as well.
So our blue goo does not have the formaldehyde. So and it's one of the most unceremonial. It's literally a hole in the ground, and we park our truck on top of the hole, open up the valve, and drain our waste tank off our truck into this hole in the ground. Very low-tech process. So then it enters the sewer plant, and whatever the sewer plant does to extract the pathogens and all the other harmful contents of human waste, our blue goo stuff, washes right down into the sewer pipe and then into Puget Sound, and our stuff does not have the formaldehyde in it that then gets into the fish. So a much better process when the blue goo is formaldehyde-free.
That's awesome. That's a big change.
We try. Yeah, we've tried.
So there's also been talk about composting the material.
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think the technology hasn't quite caught up in that realm. And I do get a few phone calls a year from folks trying to find a compostable toilet. And, our scale is such that we're just too big, and the technology has not advanced to a point where that's sort of economically or commercially feasible. Some of our big events will have 100 toilets. We did the tunnel, the 99 tunnel Alaskan Way viaduct closure, new Alaskan Way tunnel opening. We had 300 toilets out for that event. And so obviously with the technology as it is for compostable toilets, you have to physically take each container and dump it. You sort of almost shovel it out. And there's some straw that you put into it. So it's just too hard to do with 300 toilets. The company that most close to our market in Seattle, I've never talked to anybody at the company, but there's seen some internet and articles of a company in Portland that is doing that, but they have something like 30 toilets. And we have multiple sites where we have more than 30 toilets. So we're getting there as an industry, but certainly we're not there yet. And I think part of it is, as you talk about, your elements on finance and money, is we are a very low margin industry. So to make money in portable toilets, you have to have a lot of toilets. And, the big guys have tens of thousands of toilets, and we have a few hundred. So to compete, we have to do a really good job on service, because obviously the margins come with the volume. You're making a lot of money when you have a lot of toilets. And we're not there yet. And certainly as a small player, we really couldn't take that risk of doing something like a compostable toilet, because the margins just aren't there.
So when you talk about dumping the toilets or refreshing, whatever the term is, when you talk about that, you said sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. What determines all that?
So obviously frequency of service and what a client pays are very tightly correlated. The event industry, if you have a beer garden, if you have a fair, a festival, a sporting event, you have a whole lot of people come every day. And at night, we have to come around and pump those units out and get them refreshed for the next day, because nobody wants a food truck festival where you have full toilets. Construction sites, mostly we do weekly service we do a lot of small residential. We don't do a lot of the huge downtown sites. The big downtown construction sites we do twice a week is pretty standard. So we'll come on Monday and come on Wednesday morning and clean them out, super early, so that the workers will come before the workers, and they'll have clean toilets for the day. But yeah, typical is weekly, and so we come around, pump it out, and replace the blue once a week, and then so that toilet would sit there collecting the waste for the week. And in the summer, with temperatures up 70s, 80s degrees, you need to make sure you have a good resurfacing plan and good blue goo. And in some markets where it's super hot, Phoenix or down in the South Florida, Miami area, real different ballgame when it comes to the odor issues caused by the portable toilets and what a weekly service would, it's going to stink by the end of the week when you're in a hot market.
So if somebody needs portable toilets, how would they contact you?
Well, that's a great question, Mike. I like that. Thank you. Yeah, so we have a website, gogreenlatrine.com. We have an 800 number. You can call me, text me. We have a lot of clients who like to text, pick up this one, drop off this one. But yeah, our website, www.gogreenlatrine.com. And
no dots or periods in between.
Gogreenlatrine.com. That's what we are.
And you mentioned a phone number. What's that?
800-898-8203.
And for texting?
You can text my cell phone. I'll give my cell phone out on the radio. I don't care. I'll talk to anybody anytime about toilets. My cell phone, 206-898-0649.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
It's a great service you do.
And I love your show. Thanks for letting me be on it.
Thank you much. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away. I'm going to shift and talk about China. I talk about China fairly often on the program. I want to talk again because there are some issues with China and some things that are not so great about China. So stick with me. We'll come back to the Chinese right after the break.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I want to revisit China every so often because they are becoming a major player in the world, and they want to replace America as the major player. Remember back in September of 2017, they announced the program Made in China 2025. They wanted to focus on medical, computers, telecommunications, electric vehicles, advanced and basic materials, mobile devices, agricultural machinery, and robotics. And they wanted to replace the United States as the leader in technology in those fields. That was Made in China 2025, and their goal is to be there in 2025. So China likes to go big, and they like things like Nobel Prizes. The latest article in The Economist talked about that because they held what they called the World Laureates Forum. They held one last year. Again, this year, they have 44 attendees. They had Nobel Prize winners, Turing Award winners, a few economists, but they invited some of the top scientists in the world. And the idea is to build a platform for global scientific collaboration. Got that? Collaboration. Xi Jinping's letter to the guest said that China wants to work with all countries to advance science. You know, at least for Americans, it's a question of whether he wants to work with them or he wants them to share their technology with China. He wants to advance Made in China 2025. The participants spoke positively about the forum and Chinese science, but remember, China's only had one Nobel Prize winner. So they're drawing on the science and the scientific output from other countries. Those in attendance probably were past their prime time, but they want to build this forum into the most unique and interesting forum in the world. And they want China to move forward to replace America as number one. The other initiative, the Belt and Road Project, continues forward. They want to rebuild the Silk Road. Talked about that a number of times. They're spending between $1 and $8 trillion now to build railroads and power stations and ports and airports and the infrastructure in dozens of other countries around the world, especially in the emerging market countries. They want entry and leverage and political gain. It's all about increasing the Chinese global power, and they do it with what's now been called debt trap diplomacy. I've mentioned Hambantota from Sri Lanka, second busiest port in Sri Lanka. They wanted to rebuild it. They went to the Chinese. They got funding from the Chinese, from a Chinese company actually. They went through a huge upgrade. But all the money was loaned. All the money was not given. It wasn't like USAID. It was money that was loaned and loaned through a Chinese company. It was Chinese labor and technology primarily. And when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans, the Chinese company repossessed the port. Now, a good portion of the Chinese Navy is now anchored in Hambantota Port. It's a debt trap diplomacy. I had a friend who was an engineer in Liberia, and he said they built the roads to the plantations, but they built them in such a way, he was an engineer, and he could see that the roads were poorly done. And when in the monsoons, when the roads disappeared, the Chinese came in and loaned more money. And so they'll end up owning the roads in that country and the political. So we're in a struggle right now to see who's going to dominate the world in business. And that said, there's one issue that people haven't talked about that should probably be talked about, and that's that the Chinese are getting old. There's an increased discussion in China that the Chinese will get old before they get rich. Very interesting. In the next 25 years, the percent of Chinese population over 65 will grow from 12% of the population to 25%. That happens in the U.S. in the early 2100s, next century. In Europe, at the end of this century, 2080 or 2090. In 1960, the life expectancy in China was just 44 years, less than Ghana. Chinese babies born today have a life expectancy of 76 years, almost what the U.S. is. The U.S. is 78 and a half. But in 1973, China went to the one-child policy. Well, in 1973, when they went to that, the average Chinese woman was averaging 4.6 children each one. Then the one-child policy came. And today, with the two-child policy, they're averaging 1.6 children for each. And that's going to shrink even more, some say. So the impact is that the working age population began to shrink in 2012, and it's going to continue to shrink for decades to come. In 2000, there were 9 Chinese workers for every retiree. In 2050, it's projected to be just 2 for every retiree. That means when somebody's working, they not only have to generate money for their salary, they have to generate the money for a pension. That means if you're going to maintain the same pension system, they're going to have to be able to increase 50% more than they normally would. That's a significant amount. For the U.S., yeah, we will also get to 2 to 1, but ours will come in the 21st century, not in 2050. So China's social security system is going to be out of money in 2035, and shortly after that, how do they cope with that? They're probably going to see fewer workers, means growth will slow, means probably labor rates will rise, and it's going to be inflationary. And when I talk about inflation returning, and I'm talking about, and if you listen to the program, you know that I believe that this secular bull market will end with a bout of inflation. China is going to add to that, and they're going to add significantly to that. So China has some issues. They want to replace the U.S. as the leader in technology in the world. They want to replace us as the leader in the world in business. But there's some issues. There's going to be some significant issues. And maybe because I'm American, I believe that we're going to win the battle. Maybe it's a bias that I have. But whatever. I believe that it's not going to be easy to maintain our position, but that we have some advantages, and age is working for us. My hope is that my outlook is realistic, but you have to keep it in mind. And when you're looking forward, when this program, its focus is on preparing you for the future, looking forward, being ahead of the curve. And so you need to think about what's going to be happening in 2030, 2040, and 2050. Some of us won't be alive in that time. Who knows? We'll have to see. But the idea is to understand where we're headed, because in terms of aging, China is continuing to shrink their workforce per retiree. And that's going to have a very detrimental effect. It's going to be a big thing. And it's going to be a very detrimental effect for them to replace us in the world. But that doesn't mean they won't try. That doesn't mean that they won't succeed in places. And that's going to affect our investments, our portfolios, and you should be aware of that. Anyway, I want to say, have a very great weekend, a great holiday season, and I will be back next Saturday to talk more about 2020. It's interesting. In 2021, will we say we had 2020 hindsight? Have to think about that. Till next week, have a great week and weekend.
Listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.